One of the things that the book did for me is kind of shifted my understanding of the genealogy of these things, because simply knowing a little bit more about Marx, I had naturally kind of seen some of the core principles that seem similar in Marxism and these woke ideologies. And in particularly, I noticed things like the idea of class consciousness, which is mentioned in this book. So Marx denies the universality of reason, and he kind of redefines it in terms of class and power relations, broadly speaking. But so the idea is that your thinking is determined by the class that you belong to, and then if you are a member of a class, especially an underclass, and you don't think in the way that essentially that Marx thinks you ought to think as a member of that class, then you have what's called false consciousness. So it's very easy to see how this applies today to the idea of, for example, if Joe Biden saying, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black, or the idea of being an Uncle Tom, something like that. If you're a black person who has non-black supposedly opinions. And that obviously this is extended, of course, beyond class. As it turns out that I don't know if this is completely independent of Marx, but there's this idea of standpoint theory, which has a slightly different implication than class consciousness in some ways, in terms of how it understands the way power works. But I do still think that these are very much of the same spirit, and it's hard for me to imagine that these ideas would have evolved the way they did without Marx in the background somewhere. And the other biggest core similarity would be that the whole idea of criticism, that these ideologies work via constant criticism, and that's their basic orientation towards knowledge and towards reality. And Marx himself called for, quote, the ruthless criticism of all that exists. And also the activist kind of bent of it, because he also said the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. So I think I don't think somebody who refers to these ideologies as Marxian, which is the word that I've liked to use in some ways, is really being such a Philistine. But at the same time, this book helps to kind of show the more direct relevance of postmodernism, because postmodernism was, of course, a rejection of Marxism in certain ways. But I do think that in terms of the spiritual dynamics, which I think they can be called, of the philosophies, I think there's a lot in common.
No, absolutely. What you mentioned, I think, just a moment ago is important because postmodernism does rise up in France in the late 60s and the 70s as this, in part, a reaction against Marxism, but it's also a sense of despair, right? That Marxism has just failed. It's a flop. Looking at really existing Marxism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and whatnot, I mean, the bloom was very much off the rose by the 70s, and so there was a rejection in many ways of Marxism. But I think you're right, Thomas, that some of these sensibilities, and certainly that activist orientation of Marxism, was very much shared by postmodernism. That might be just simply because the postmodernists were already, well, certainly in the 70s, for the most part, men, not wholly men, but mostly men of the left. And so they're kind of embracing the culture of the left. They're embracing the political values of the left. And so I think many of the values that are in Marxism are many of the same values that are in postmodernism. I would also say, in some ways, they might actually be shared with liberalism as well.
Yeah. Yes, that makes sense, and I think we'll make that argument later. So I guess coming away from this book, my impression of, I had read some of these critiques of Jordan Peterson, saying, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about with postmodernism and Marxism. I guess I when I read those critiques, I thought, well, this sounds plausible, that maybe he's conflating a few things or being a little sloppy in his history. But at the same time, these criticisms seem largely pedantic in terms of, I think he gets the underlying kind of dynamics of these philosophies and the way that they can work together correct. So
I think that's mostly correct, right? I mean, because there's definitely a genealogy that Pluckrose and Lindsay don't really go through in this book that you can really draw from Marxism right into some of the forms of postmodernism that they talk about. So, for example, postcolonial theory. Postcolonial theory is very much indebted to people like Antonio Gramsci, and Gramsci is very much of a Marxist. And so this kind of cultural turn in Marxism is something that happened in the early 20th century. And it's an attempt, especially by Western Marxists, to understand why has the revolution not come here, right? Why did the revolution come to Russia, the backwards East, and it didn't come to the most advanced Western countries like Marx thought it was? And so you get a rise of what some people would call cultural Marxism in the 1920s and 1930s. Gramsci's part of that, and Gramsci is very influential in some of the, especially like post-colonial theory. That is in this book. So there is, in some cases, right, a much more direct connection. The one major difference, though, that I think is important to keep in mind is that at least the more kind of classical forms of Marxism, if you will, are always deeply materialistic. And postmodernism, in many ways, is anti-materialistic. I mean, especially when one gets into some of the queer theory stuff, it is anti-materials. It is anti-biology. It has a very different understanding of what we might call the real world is, what its nature is, what influence it has on us, and whether we can even know anything about it. And there, I think it's important to keep in mind how Marxism and postmodernism are quite different.
Yeah. And there's another difference mentioned briefly by the authors of this book that I think has a great deal of significance for the practical outcome of a lot of these movements, which is that these postmodern scholars have all but neglected class. You know, they talk about race, they talk about sex, gender, sexuality, and a number of other things, but class is pretty neglected. You know, I think the authors might suggest somewhere that, you know, some of this may be because these are privileged, you know, middle class to upper middle class academics discussing these things, and they're also academics, and a lot of them are literary people, so they're talking about language and things like that rather than material conditions. But that may prove to be actually, I think so far probably has had quite an influence on the success of these movements and the types of people who have found themselves rejecting them. I think that that's going to continue to play a role in the future in the kind of the way that society divides up on these issues.
I mean, I think that lack of interest in class is also, you know, probably one of the most defining features of postmodernism and how it differs from Marxism. But I think it's rooted in the left's despair of the 1960s. I mean, by the time you're getting into the late 1960s, the left is looking at the working class in Western countries and just throwing up their hands and saying, this is not a revolutionary class. These are not people that want to overturn everything. So we have to look somewhere else. The revolutionary group has got to be somewhere out there, because that's an article of faith. You believe in the revolution. You believe in the necessity of the revolution. Wow. But it just doesn't look like it's going to come from the working class anymore. And in many countries, that the working class becomes increasingly conservative. And so you just kind of see that in the United States as well. It takes quite a long time, but you know, now you've got at least certainly white working class people are mostly Republicans, rather than, you know, 30 years ago, they're mostly Democrats. So I think that's an important part of it too. They're despairing over the old political project, and they have to find a new revolutionary people. And they start finding them in especially racial groups, and in obviously women's studies becomes gender studies, becomes sexuality studies. So you see it in different sexuality identity groups and so on.